Gold in Aussie dollars reaches a record high as the US heads to Israel. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainsley Insights, brought to you by Ainsley Bullion, Ainsley Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainsley Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Sam, who's been continuing his analysis on the escalating situation in the Middle East and the impact on the prices of precious metals, in particular gold, with it reaching that new all-time high once again. How are you going today, Sam?
Good, Chris. Good to be back. How you doing?
Not too bad. Now, it's a lot going on in the world at the moment. You've
Mhm.
written another piece today, really narrowing in on some recent developments. But before we get into sort of that angle of looking at what's going on in the Middle East and how that could be impacting, we had a bit of data last week that was quite significant, which was that consumer price index coming in higher than expected. Do you think that that is part of what's driving what we're seeing going on here with gold, particularly people being worried that that inflation is going to continue?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And to think that cutting interest rates and keeping inflation low is just an impossibility for people who know the real definition of inflation. For thousands of years, it's been the money supply,
Hmm.
not the effective money supply increasing, because that's just a given. So keeping inflation low, I mean, you and I both know it's only going to get worse the more they cut. And if you look at, for example, not just the United States, but what China's doing with their stimulus, being pressured to do more. And even you look at Australia, Commonwealth Banks just come out today and said that they think that the RBA is going to cut in December as well.
Hmm.
So the global spigots are turning on, and looks like the money's going to be flowing and driving up inflation further.
And that's really interesting, the Commonwealth Bank coming out and saying that, because I mean, she'd made it pretty clear that her intention was not to raise rates in Australia until next year. But that seems to have been brought forward. And I tended to think that would probably be the case as well, because you can't really fight what's going on in the US. If they're cutting rates, we end up having to follow. What do you think, is that part of what's going on here and the impact that we've seen on this record high price in gold in Aussie? Is it that expectation that we really are just going to follow that trend, or other factors at play? Because I mean, I do want to talk about what's happening in the Middle East as well. What's your view overall on the play between the geopolitical events and the inflationary pressures that are going on at this moment?
Well, of course, Australia is going to disconnect from the world, the United States, China, everyone, and just do their own thing with interest rates. Of course, that'll happen, right? So, yeah, a lot of people have been saying Australia will just acquiesce and end up cutting like everyone else, albeit a little bit later. But yeah, we just can't afford to have our currency too expensive, and people know that.
Mm.
Who's going to buy our iron ore if they can't afford it? And what's going to happen to the Australian economy if we don't sell natural resources? Our whole ASX is just propped up by iron ore sales. So, of course, we can't have that powerful of a dollar. It's just not good for us. And, controlling things like property prices, okay, it's very, very hard to own um, anything more than a shoebox for someone who's looking for their first property,
Mm.
but you can't sacrifice the whole country to make property a little bit cheaper. And then you have property investors as well who want to see their properties go up forever. So that's another problem, same as in China.
And do you think that ultimately we like that is the main driver of what's pushing gold up at the moment, or do you think it's also playing in from the geopolitical front? I mean, what sort of ratio would you assign there? Because it feels almost like a perfect storm, but you've got both of these things happening at once.
Yeah. Yeah, it does feel like a perfect storm. Look, I think a little bit more would be on the interest rate side of things. I think, a conflict like this, if it's going to spill over globally or become World War III, something like that, um, I can't say. If we talked before, are we in World War III now? Nobody
Mm.
knows. But look, it's not. There aren't bombs hitting Melbourne. But what is happening is the global money supply is changing. So I'd say that has probably more of an effect on the markets now. And then more with the war side of things is probably a longer term, more of a gold bug, sort of more of a security sort of investment, a little bit longer term.
That's a really important analysis. I think that it really is the economic side that is driving it more, in your view, at least at the moment, because a lot of people will only ever ascribe the they'll say the price is because of one thing. They can't get their head around there's a lot of things at play. So I think that's really important to sort of differentiate.
That is true. And it can be really painful reading news when something, whatever assets being traded or whatever stock's being traded, you'll see 3 different articles come out and they'll say this moved because of X.
Yes.
And it's very obviously 80% of it is for another reason, but they're attributing it to whatever the company had good profits or came out with the new products, not every other stock did the exact same thing or every other safe haven did the exact same thing. They're just not good at finding the cause and effect.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the number one mistake I think many people make writing these articles, but also reading them. I want to dig a little bit deeper into what's actually going on with that geopolitical sort of situation, because I know you look at that quite closely, and it rings in my ear every week when we talk about these things. A comment that you made, and you referenced it just before, that you wouldn't know World War III, for example, isn't an event, right? Like it's not something that everyone just says, oh, we're starting that today. It's a series of things that sort of build up over time. I thought that was a really great analysis that you made a number of weeks ago, and it's sort of stuck with me since then. Can you talk to me a little bit about what is specifically going on here when we talk about the US really entering this more actively than they have in the past with Israel? Maybe a little bit of background on that, and then if there is a flow on there for gold prices, is what you sort of see that likely to be.
Okay, so the major point here is other countries getting dragged into a war.
Yep.
And in this case, it's the United States, and the war would be against Iran. And we've gone through before about a roughly a decade or so long plan ending with Iran. So funnily enough, here we go. Things are kind of coming together, it looks like, or coming apart, I might say, depending on how you look at it. Mm. So weapon sales, of course, the United States, the UK, Russia, countries sell a huge amount of weapons all over the world. The difference between selling or providing weapons to someone and being engaged in the conflict is if personnel are killed, maimed, anything like that, it draws the entire country in potentially. So Israel's weaponry comes from the United States. Big surprise, right? Kalashnikov, AK-47s, they come from Russia. Big surprise. That doesn't necessarily mean they're personally involved. But what's going to happen now is, with the Pentagon confirming they're sending hundreds of U.S. military personnel inside of Israel to join with these anti-ballistic missile systems, essentially these large trucks with missiles on the back, which can arc upward and then launch missiles to take down other missiles. And they need actual military to operate and maintain these systems, in this case, U.S. personnel. So what's going to happen is, if, say, an Iranian missile comes down and hits these personnel, that's another reason to drag the U.S. into a war with Iran almost immediately. Now, this would be an absolute dream come true for Netanyahu. He'd like nothing more than to see the U.S. Step in and fight this battle for him and take over, fighting everyone else as well, including Hezbollah, for example. But this is a very serious escalation, because this is moving U.S. troops into the line of fire, whereas before they were just in surrounding friendly countries, offering things like if missiles were sent over from Iran, they could help shoot them down. So that's the big, I guess, quantum leap forward, and this could be in the near future a bigger reason to buy gold than whatever banks are doing with interest rates.
So it's not necessarily today, but it's something that you would be paying close attention to, because if that does escalate, that's the sort of thing that really sends the price just rocketing, as people don't know what happens next, I suppose.
Emphasis on necessarily, not necessarily. Yeah, we don't have a crystal ball. I can't guarantee nothing will happen tonight or in the next 5 minutes or in the next week. But yeah, it is a pretty serious escalation when the U.S. is getting directly involved with troops.
Well, we'll leave it there, but we'll continue to pay attention to that and keep getting you back on to keep us updated, because it obviously is a significant escalation. I think that's would be pretty obvious to most people listening. And when you tie that back to gold, it's one of those situations where you probably want to be a little bit earlier rather than later if that were to play out, because we have seen this in the past, where, well, I mean, I remember back what it was like in office here at the start of that Ukraine war, where you really had people panic buying, would be how I would describe it, coming in and just buying whatever they could. And it really, really takes off quite quickly when these things escalate to a point that becomes obvious to everyone. I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah, 100%. Lots of things just suddenly rocketed, commodities as well. But yeah, I totally agree.
All right. Well, thank you for your work on that. We'll stay in touch and we'll keep paying attention. But thanks for today, Sam.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.